Hi, Tony.
Hello, Sophia. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Welcome to Ideology Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. I've been looking forward to it.
So I would love to indulge and ask you to speak in Swahili. I found out that you lived in Kenya for a period, and it would be nice if you could say hello in Swahili.
Okay. Well, I'll say hello to all your viewers. Habari zenu, natumaini kwamba mko nzima sana. Nafurahi sana kuwa hapa na Sophia. Sophia means clean, right? In Swahili.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
But I also
So,
a Greek meaning, which is wisdom, because I like to think I'm pretty wise.
okay. Well, it's good. Clean wisdom doesn't get better than that.
You have a new book out called Love and Suffering: Breaking the Emotional Chains That Prevent You from Experiencing Love. I think love in all its guises is a topic that consumes a lot of my time lately. And I spend a lot of time thinking, where did the love go? Because when I grew up in the 90s, so much of our culture, music, art, movies, was all about love. Maybe romantic love too much, but everything was about love. You know, whether it was boys to men pining away and crying over
Mm.
a breakup, and just everything was dominated by love.
The end of the road.
They
Wonderful song.
would come back down on bended knees,
Exactly. Exactly.
but that is completely absent, I feel, for a generation coming up. The best they can do is, love as in sex, and that's really all I see that's being presented to them. Intimacy, commitment, family, all of these things seem to be missing. Where do you think we went wrong?
Well, what you're saying, Sophia, is really true. There's actually research on this that's found that if you look, for example, in popular songs, the usage of the word love has like been cut in half over the last few decades, and actually, negative emotions are now being expressed much more than positive. But even if you look over time, you see that more and more negative emotions as opposed to a few decades ago, and much less positive emotions being shared in our popular songs. So yeah, I think there is. I mean, the whole idea of like a lot of people. It's not just young people; it's older people too. That that are kind of pursuing sex rather than love. Is it this idea that well, sex will lead to love, but that generally doesn't happen. It's usually the other way around. And I think it's often about the short-term fix. The way I say it is that there's a distinction I make between fun and fuel.
Mhm.
Fun stands for fulfilling us now,
Mhm.
and fuel stands for fulfilling us even later. And I see a lot of people today, especially young people, it's all about what's going to fulfill me right now, and that's what's fun, and that's what I'm going to do. But then later, there are complaints like my life hasn't gone in the direction that I want it to go in, which is why we're seeing this sort of skyrocketing anxiety and depression among young people, all ages, but especially young people. Also, loneliness. It's really sad. Like the Gallup came out with a world happiness report just recently, and in the U.S. and Western Europe, the least happy people are the youngest generation.
Wow.
And I attribute that to on some level to these things. We're trying to communicate with our phones and with our laptops and tablets instead of communicating face to face, and that's just not leading to it's not leading to like healthy lives for many young people. I did a study recently in a middle school and found that some of what young people are sharing about their screens and about the way their parents use their screens. It's just depressing, actually. I mean, I have one quote of young guys in sixth grade saying, "I'm lonely. I have no friends. I love my phone." And then I've got another one who's also well, a fifth grader, and he's sharing. He says that he really wants to spend time with his father, but the power of scrolling on his phone is just too powerful for his father. And so you just see like how this is all taking place. We can't point the finger at young people because we're the ones who have set up this like digitally mediated environment we're in. We
Yeah.
say we point the finger at one person, we have three pointed back at ourselves,
Yes.
and we have to take responsibility for what's happening and turn it around while we can.
Yeah. I'm finding it such a struggle, actually. If I speak for myself, I notice that I have to check my own,
Mhm.
narcissism that comes from the Instagram life. Now, I've grown up without the internet. I can't imagine what the challenges are for somebody who has literally no memory or no wiring in their brain for a life without a phone, a life without the internet.
That's it. I mean, there's so much has changed, and if we look, I'll ask your viewers, like, what do you think the number one reported emotion of Facebook users is?
Anxiety,
And what's that?
anxiety, I would say, no?
Anxiety is very high, depression, loneliness, but the number one reported emotion is envy. And
Envy.
so what happens is this is this narcissism you're talking about that we all have, Sophia. We all want to be, we want to be recognized. We want to feel worthy. We want to be approved of. We want to be accepted. We want to belong. And so we go on social media and we post pictures and post anything to flatter ourselves. So men tend to post pictures after they buffed up. They've been exercising all week. Women tend to post photos where they haven't been eating for a week, and
Mhm,
they even use there's shrinking software that sometimes some women use, and
mhm,
it's all showing this kind of misrepresentation of ourselves intended for others to accept us.
mhm,
And then the irony is that you go on social media and you go on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, and you see pictures of like the one picture from a friend's week-long family vacation where everyone's smiling. And then you say, well, why doesn't my family smile like that? Why are we so miserable? And
yes.
so we feel worse about ourselves. So this dates back. We want to consider what it was it like before the internet. Let's take a look at what was it like before the predecessor of the internet, one of the predecessors, which was the television.
Mhm,
So Karen Hennigan, social psychologist, did this study in the late 1970s where she looked at in the United States in 1951 was when the television was first introduced and sold.
okay.
And there were 47 municipalities where the local government said, we're not accepting the TV. Like, that's not coming here. Like, we don't want all these outside influences. So, no TVs in our small towns or cities. And so, what Hennigan and her colleagues did is they examined those 47 towns and cities with 47 similar towns and cities where the television was introduced. And what they found is that in the 47 cities where the TV was allowed to be sold in 1951, there was this huge upsurge in petty crime and misdemeanors like pickpocketing, stealing bicycles. And what they found the reason was because all of a sudden, what people were seeing on their televisions, all these other people who had like yachts and private jets and better clothing, more expensive clothing than they did, and so forth. And so bigger cars. And so they said, well, why aren't our lives like that? And then they started taking from others. And so then what was interesting is in the 47 towns and cities, the many municipalities where the TV was not introduced, there was no increase. But 4 years later, there was a federal overruling of these local bans saying, you can't ban our citizens from having TVs. So in these other 47 cities in 1955, finally the television could be sold. And you know what they found?
Yeah.
The same upsurge in petty crime misdemeanors following the introduction of the TV in those towns. So we go online seeking social information,
Mhm.
but sorry, I'm sorry, I mixed that up. We go
Uh,
online seeking social connection. We want to connect with others. We want to belong. We want to be accepted. But we end up with this social information, which instead of making us feel accepted and like we belong, it just compounds those feelings of loneliness and depression and anxiety. And that's kind of part of what's gotten us to where we are today.
well, would you say it's different seeing someone on screen who's much, better off than you? Because I'm just thinking if I go by that, walking around London, there's a million people better dressed than me on any given day who look, so wealthy compared to me. What's the difference with that, would you say? Because we were always surrounded by neighbors who are wealthier than us, who are doing better than us,
Mhm.
maybe their children were better behaved, all of the things we desire. How's that different?
Well, Sophia, so this goes back to Leon Fessinger's research, the social psychologist, on social comparison, which is a concept he came up with, which is that when we feel insecure about ourselves and we want to feel worthy, we want to increase our self-esteem, we
Mhm,
try to find other people similar to us, and
mhm,
then we compare ourselves with them. And we want to find people that we compare ourselves favorably with. So we're like, oh, that person is so miserable, I feel better about myself, that kind of thing.
mhm,
So we always have done that as human beings. So the difference is that when people go on social media, um, they don't get the positive elements of human interaction. They
uh-huh,
just get the social comparison. So you go on there and now you see your high school friends and others around your age, and why are they so successful and good looking and
yes,
wealthy and I'm not?
yes,
And so this is the thing, is that in the end, like, we turn off our screen and we're just sitting there alone and
mm,
lonely,
mm,
um, versus like, okay, let me go out with a friend who's doing really well. Wow, I'm impressed.
yeah.
Yeah, I wish I was doing as well as he is in certain domains, but you know what? I'm also glad that he's my friend or she's my friend. I mean, we enjoyed our time together. And so that kind of offsets the negative feelings of social comparison.
Oh, that's such a good explanation. Because again, if you went to lunch with the friend that you envy, they would also tell you all the difficulties of the job they're
Hmm.
in, of the marriage that, gave you the highlight reel. So you would go away and you would humanize them. How
Yeah,
interesting.
imagine, Sophia, that someone, you meet a friend for lunch. Let's call her Maria. So Maria sits down and says, Sophia, guess what? My husband is so cute. Oh
Mhm.
my God, he's doing so well in his job. My kids are adorable. My daughter is singing in the school choir. And I mean, this is the way we communicate on social media,
Mhm. That's
right?
true. That's
So
really,
no one communicates like that in person. You know why? Because no one's going to go to lunch with you again if you do,
yeah.
you know?
Oh, we have, so you're saying we're actually very antisocial on social media. We just brag all the time. Look at me, look at my beautiful lunch that I had, look at the clothes I'm wearing, look at, the makeup and how I did my makeup today.
Yeah, I mean, as I write about this in my last book, Screened In, The Art of Living Free in the Digital Age, that social media is not social and it's not media. So first of all, for the reason we're talking about, it's antisocial. It's not social, but also it's not media as we consider media. I mean, sharing what you had for lunch is not media. The reason we have like curators of popular media, like yourself in your video podcast here, Sophia, or like magazine and newspaper editors, is because they filter through all of the information and
Mhm.
try to find, well, what's really the news we're sharing,
Mm.
and sharing that you just graduated, or that you I mean, that's actually kind of worthy. But a lot of what we share about, like, hey, here's a picture of us dancing last night at this club, like, okay, that is kind of interesting, but is that really, like, at what level are we oversharing? And I think 99% of what we see on social media would fit that description.
That's so interesting. I'm so glad you highlighted that because I think we all feel the effect of it. So you talk about our misguided image of masculinity. Can you explain the image of masculinity you talk about? Because I think many will see your criticism of traditional masculinity as an attack. How can we have this conversation so that the extreme conversations that are being had on Twitter? So I'll give you an example. In preparation for my discussion, I went on Twitter to really look at masculinity. So I'm not going to say the name of the person who tweeted this, but I'd like to read you just a few lines from a tweet. So this is a very well-known social media person. Dear white men, you're effed. You're being replaced because none of you have children. Even those of you bitching about the replacement online like little girls don't find the gumption to F. I see white men bragging about having 5 kids as if it's an achievement. Lol. 5, LOL, per year, right? All of you white boys lost control of your women, and now they won't accept multiple wives anymore. It's just filled with expletives, so I'm not going to read you the whole thing. Normally, I would look at someone like that and think, okay, they're just shouting into an abyss. It doesn't matter. But this is a very influential social media personality who I would say probably has more of a bigger following and reach than most broadcasters, and maybe even all of our broadcasters combined. I kept thinking I shouldn't have done this research, to be honest.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Let's talk about it, because I think what's important here is not, it's not who's saying what, but it's about the, what's really, what are the mistakes that many people are making in terms of what they perceive it means to be a man. And I think a lot of people are angry, including, of course, this person that you cited, because they don't understand what the role of men is anymore. Like, what are men here for? I mean, if we look at, so traditionally men have it's been the 3 P's, what men do, right? So it's procreation, production, and provision. So men procreate, provide, and produce. And well, that's all kind of been threatened lately, even in the last few decades. I mean, now, so there's still a very high earnings premium for a college education. People who earn a college education tend to do much better economically than those who don't. And for every 2 men globally who are receiving a university degree now, there are 3 women. We're seeing in the United States, 50% of managers are women, right? I mean, there's even in fields that were traditionally considered male, like there were, I think if you go back to, let me get it right, I think 1979, I think 4% of individuals in the US earning law degrees were women. It's now half, right? We're seeing now, if you look now at the 16 most reputable law schools in the world, every single one has a woman as their editor-in-chief of their law review. So we're seeing like tremendous shifts in the workplace. So, and in fact, we're seeing that the less and less households even have males as the primary breadwinner, right? In some communities, it's less than half. And especially in low-income communities, it tends to be 60 to 70% of households, the primary breadwinner is a woman. And even in middle and high-income communities, it's coming closer to half now, half and half. So women have been really shifting towards sort of economic success. And so if you think about the traditional dichotomy where the man is the breadwinner, the woman is the caretaker, right, of children and so forth. Well, that's really been flipped on its head, where now men are no longer the primary breadwinners, again, in about half of households. And yet they're not making the shift toward being a primary or even close to primary caretaker. Right. And this is causing massive problems. Essentially, women are gaining economically and men are not gaining socially. Right. So if you look at, for example, what Antonelli, who's a researcher in the United States, she's for the last 20 years, she and a team of her colleagues have been researching what are called social convoys. Social convoys are the close relationships that travel with you through life. If you compare the social convoys of men versus the social convoys of women, I hate to tell you guys, but women are blowing us out of the water. Like literally, if you the chances of, if you have a couple that's divorced, which is about half of couples, and you look like 5 or 10 years later, the woman is almost never not still in the social convoy of her children. With men, sometimes not. Many men are no longer in that social convoy, no longer close with their children. If you're looking at the rates of deaths of desperation right? Suicide, alcoholism, drug overdose, and so forth. With men, especially in the middle age and above, it's becoming the leading cause of death. In fact, in the UK, where you are, Sophia, the leading cause of death for men under 45 is suicide, right? So we're seeing this huge increase in these deaths of desperation and among men as they're growing older. And why is that? Well, here's an interesting statistic. If you take a man and a woman at 60 years old and each one loses their spouse, the
Mhm.
chance of that woman living another year is much higher than that man living another year. Why? Because for the man, his wife passes away, and with her goes his whole social network. All of a sudden, he's isolated and alone. For a woman over at 60 or over, her husband passes away, and it's like, this is tragic. This is so sad. I feel devastated. I'm going to go see my girlfriend, And so there's this huge difference. And that roots back to these misguided perceptions of what a man should be. And let's see. So we consider ourselves gender enlightened. Here's how gender enlightened we are today, right? A study in the US, what they did was they looked at a fully employed woman and an unemployed husband, and how many more hours per week is that husband doing of childcare and housework?
Mhm.
So you would think quite a bit, right? Because she's working full time and he's at home all day. He's doing on average 6 hours more per week of childcare and housework. This is Pew Research Center study. Now, if you flip it and you have a fully employed man with an unemployed wife in the US, how many more hours of childcare and housework is she doing? Instead of 6 hours more per week that the man is doing, and if you reverse the situation, in the case where the woman is unemployed, the man's working full time, she is doing 46 hours more per week of childcare and housework, 750% more. So we think we're all gender enlightened, and we're still in the dark ages of gender relations. And this needs to be fixed because men need to find their role again. And so anyone who's going to go out and spout a lot of rhetoric about how men are great and women are not, sure, they're going to build a bunch of followers, but you got to ask, what kind of falsehoods are they really perpetuating? And
Yeah.
who's buying into that? And a lot of the people buying into that are people who feel disenfranchised. And I think a lot of men feel that way. And we, instead of getting angry about it, we need to do something about it. We need to understand, like, well, men are becoming isolated. How can we change that? I'll give you one example. Okay, I'm 56,
Mhm.
right? Let's pretend you're another guy, Sophia, right? And I go up to you and say, let's say I go up to you and say, hey, do you want to grab lunch sometime? Or hey, we should go out and grab dinner or grab
Yeah.
a drink. Well, what are you going to think,
I
right?
would go to dinner.
You're going to think that, but a lot of men will say, okay, this guy is needy, this guy is weak, or maybe he's coming on to me. There's all these kind of obstacles we have for men to form
Friendship.
friendships with other men, and as a result, we become isolated. Men used to have like the sort of basement cave where
Yeah.
they'd have dress all appropriately. They could just come and be casual in sweatpants and
Yeah.
hang out. And those are gone. We've remodeled those basement and in-law spaces to rent them on Airbnb as apartments or rooms. I mean, we like where do men go now? Right? A lot of the institutions where men would go and be able to bond in a healthy way are gone.
What about
And so
sports bars? Because I watched quite male type shows, and all I see is men going to sports bars, and they go to the bar, and they go to dinner, and they golf. That's the impression we get as women.
well, that's why we watch those shows. The same reason that millions of people follow tweets like the one you saw is because it's presenting a world that's fictitious that we wish we were living in, but we're no longer living in. Like that was the success of the show Entourage. Right? It was basically like, let's see, and a lot of people would say, I've heard a lot of my friends' wives, for example, would say, "Oh, you're just watching that because there's all these beautiful women on the show and so forth." Well, that didn't hurt. But
Yeah.
let me tell you, one of the main reasons that us guys would tune into Entourage because we're seeing five guys who are loyal to each other no matter what.
Oh,
And they're hanging out, they're going out for meals together, they're having fun together, they're enjoying each other's company, and we're all sitting alone, isolated, lonely in our homes without that, and wishing we had that.
that makes me so sad to hear. Because you would think that most women would want that for their husbands. If they have that bro, a real bro, then even if there's like marital conflict, then you can reach out to his brother. And that's the impression that I had too.
There's a really hilarious Saturday Night Live skit about women taking their husbands to a man park, and in the man park, like a dog park, they would sort of get their husband to go and socialize with other men in the park, like because that's how bad it's gotten.
Wow. And so then this is it. Like, can we stay with that? What has gone wrong? Do you think it's because men are in competition with each other constantly, and we women are, but I think we get to a stage in our lives, especially once you're married, I think women kind of drop it a bit, and you're not even in your career. You try and think, okay, strategically, how can we support each other so that maybe because there aren't that many women in the workplace, but I know for sure that we overcome the things that stop us from being a good sister or a good,
Mm.
and then the women who we can't do that with are no longer in the circle. So,
Yeah, I mean, so that's right. I mean, so men and women are both competitive. Men and women are both aggressive. Men, it tends to be more physical. Women tends to be more verbal. But of course, it varies based on the individual. These are just like national and cross cultural studies. But like, if you look at aggressiveness, for example, 97% of mass shooters are male. 90% of people committing felonies are male. So there's, it's 9 out of 10. I mean, and most of the time their victims are male. And so there's this sort of male versus male aggression, um, attempts at domination, competition, and that's the thing. Like, there's part of that I think can be very positive. This is the way guys bond. Like, we insult each other, we make jokes, and we know that we're just doing that. And women sometimes would just be appalled at the kind of jokes guys will make with each other, which are really kind of endearing and like saying, "Hey, I want to be your friend, but this is the way we do that," and then that kind of jockeying back and forth. And But then I think the challenge is just that men are struggling to find ways to connect with each other that are not always about competition, and even to come to connect with each other at all. I'm actually writing some articles now called "Separate but Unequal: Men, Women, and Remote Work," and we're finding that typical male occupations like engineers, computer programmers, statisticians, mathematicians, and if you compare that with typical women occupations like psychologists, educators, and so forth, that many more men now are working remotely than women are, and so even becoming more isolated because it's easier to kind of to sort of going to sort of look at this at a more foundational level. There's a lot of research that shows that men tend to really excel at cognitive focus, tend to focus on objects, things, and the way those interact with each other. So I experienced this when I took my wife and our kids to Ischia. We live in Rome, so we went to Ischia off the coast of Napoli for the Easter break, and we went to a concert, which my wife and I, as you can imagine, enjoyed much more than our small children. But they tried to. It was a piano concert for like an hour and a half, and you had this internationally renowned pianist there, and I'm just watching him for an hour and a half, and this guy is completely immersed and attuned to this object, the piano, and it's like he's just communicating with this piano like you could never see somewhere else. It was amazing, right? This Italian pianist. And so it dawned on me, like I bet that the top pianists in the world, if you go look through history, I bet you that they're almost all men. Because who's going to spend their whole career just devoted to understanding how this object works and making it work better? The piano. And sure enough, I went through like eight different studies, and 90% of whom we consider to be the top pianists in history, even up to modern days. So even if you look at sexism from way before, it's still 9 out of 10 are men. And I think part of this is this sort of extreme cognitive focus. Now, if you look at women, where men tend to be really good at cognitive focus, women tend to excel in cognitive flexibility. So even if you look at the way men think neurologically, most of the neurons are firing in one hemisphere at a time. Whereas for women, there's a lot more cross-hemispheric neuronic traffic where there's a lot of thinking between the hemispheres. And so, for example, if you show men and women a picture where you have a protagonist in the middle and then you've got a lot of peripheral details, the men are going to focus on the protagonist much more, the real focus on that protagonist, whereas the women will notice much more of the peripheral details than the men will. And you think about it, where did that come from? It's this tremendous drive toward domination and competition, because if you're going to be competitive, you got to focus on your competitor directly. Whereas if you're collaborative, well, now you can interact with a lot of different people, right? And to see how this can work across gender, and why men are losing out so much socially. When I was living in Claremont, California, I was teaching there and at California State University. This was like 5-7 years ago, and I remember I decided to form a men's group, and so we had, like, I got this other guy, Chris, and we co-founded the group, and it took us about 4 months to get a group together, about 8 or 10 guys, where like any given month, about 6 guys would show up, and and we would have a potluck dinner at someone's house, and we spent an hour and a half, 2 hours just talking about life, and each person had time to share whatever they wanted to share. It was wonderful. So, but by the way, I would say a quick lesson for your viewers: if you're going to have a potluck dinner, what we call that in the U.S., where a potluck dinner where everyone brings their own food, don't do it with all guys. Because I was telling some of these guys, I was like, potato chips don't count as a dish to bring. Like, sorry, you cannot bring a 6-pack of Coca-Cola and that counts as your dish, right? So this created a problem. Anyway, so this group was going really well. So my wife really loved the idea. She had actually done a similar group before when we lived in Barcelona. So she thought maybe she should do it again. Watching my group kind of flourish, she'll do it again in Claremont. So she sends some text messages, some WhatsApp messages, a few calls. The next day in our backyard, there are 15 women sitting in a circle, right? So like the ability of women to come together, to socially interact, this cognitive flexibility, let's change what we're doing, let's find a way to all meet up, and it's really tremendous. And I think this is one of the real challenges that men are facing today, is that if you're focusing just on producing and the competition that entails, and providing, also competition, and procreating, well, as you get older, where you're not producing as much, you're not providing as much, and especially once you're retired, and you're not procreating at all, well, what do? It's like the former CEO of Kodak. Once he decided to retire, he committed suicide. He said, and he wrote a suicide note saying, well, since I'm not working anymore, why wait?
Wow. Yeah. And he didn't have children, or?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. We have to check on that.
Because again, this is what you mentioned about the social isolation. Do you think, because I'm not convinced that we need to think of this as traditional male-female. I think something went awry, because in the olden days, I guess when we were all, living off the land, the man had to be in his homestead. He had to also, provide in that sense, in a very immediate sense, be involved with the children. And so men are able to do this. And now what I think prevents them is they have ideas in their head of what a man is, and having that income and having that job that takes them away from their families, and then spending very little time at the end of the day with your wife and your children. And then after 10 years, 20 years, the children have left. They have literally no memories. They don't know who dad is. And so that must be why you have superficial relationships at work where it was all about competition. You didn't spend time with your family or with friends outside of your work environment. 20 years later, 30 years later, you've retired. Of course, you have no life to fall back on. And we're living longer now. So, do you think that's what it is, the crisis that we're seeing?
Well, I think you're onto something there, Sophia. That's a huge part of it. I mean, men, as you said, men are 100% capable of rising to this challenge of being present fathers. It's like when I once heard Thich Nhat Hanh, the founder of mindfulness,
Mm-hmm.
the Vietnamese monk who founded mindfulness. I heard him speak at the Warner Theater in Washington D.C. and he asked over 10,000 people. He said, "What is the greatest gift you can give to the person you love?" And everybody went quiet. And then he
Mm-hmm.
said, "To be fully present." And
Mm-hmm.
so to be fully present with our children, first of all, it means we have to put them as our first priority. And if you look at end of life interviews where people are elderly and don't have much time left in their lives, like what's given their life the most meaning? For men, the number one thing is the time they spent with their loved ones and with their children, with their kids, right? But if you ask men when they're much younger,
Yeah.
and women,
Mm-hmm.
you ask them like what's most important to you in life, what gives your life the most meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Women will mention their children like 3 times as much as men will in those interviews.
Yeah.
And so a lot of men don't realize. I think a lot of it is, Bruce Springsteen said this really well. He said that like he used to be like his kids would come in to his like home office where he's writing songs and working on his music, and they would come in and distract him and with all wanted to play and do this and that. And he said he for many decades he would say, no, I got to do this, I've got to work. And he said one day he just realized that was the wrong approach, and he started saying yes. And just they would come in and he would say yes. And I think about that every time one of our children comes in and interrupt me, because I've been the one that's often said, no, I've got to do this, even trying to ushering them out of my office, I really got to work. And now I just try to say yes.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it means I get up earlier, I get up at 5 instead of 6,
Mm-hmm.
I can get more work done.
Yeah.
um, but it's and also it means that we have to say no to work sometimes. We have to recognize that our work is not our worth. Our
Yeah.
worth goes far beyond that. And
Yeah.
then when we say no to one thing in life, we're always saying yes to something else.
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves, like, well, what is it we really want, as we're going through life?
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to change. We have to not just go through life, we have to grow through life and
Mm-hmm.
see how can we change, how can we evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony is that what we consider to be masculine is really just about one singular human quality, which is assertiveness. What we consider to be feminine is really about another singular human quality, which is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us need to balance those two. We
Yeah.
each need to find our own unique style to be both empathetic and assertive. As I teach in my leadership courses, if you're just empathetic all the time, you become a doormat and people walk all over you. If
Mm-hmm.
you're just assertive all the time, you become aggressive, narcissistic, toxic. We need to find that balance between empathy and assertiveness. And it's a moving target. It's never going to be exactly the same place. And we have to always be open to it, embrace it, and see how can we be both. I mean, I think when men are empathetic,
Mm-hmm.
they're considered to be feminine and weak and
Mm-hmm.
so forth by their opponents. When women are assertive, they're considered to be aggressive and toxic and the angry B word by their opponents.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, women have it much worse than men because whenever you have intergroup relations in social psychology, it's always the person who's in the minority who's criticized more than the person in the majority. The majority criticizes the minority much more than the reverse. So women in predominantly male organizations
Mm-hmm.
are always experiencing this, where when they're assertive, Kim Campbell, the former Prime Minister of Canada, she said it really well. She said, my career was really short-lived as Prime Minister. And the reason was I spoke the way a leader ought to speak, but I didn't speak the way a woman ought to speak. And so there are these system justifiers, people who try to preserve the status quo, like the person you know who tweeted that you quoted,
Mhm.
and and you know we got to move beyond that. We got to find, if we want to be more gender enlightened,
Mhm.
we have to move beyond these traditional designations and see that they're getting flip flopped all over the place. I mean, let's take the 2008 Democratic nomination in the United States. It was between an empathetic man, Barack Obama, and an assertive woman, Hillary Clinton. You see,
Mhm.
so we're not all enacting these stereotypes as we once did, and we have to be open to accept people as they are. Andre 3000,
Mhm.
the rapper from Outkast.
Yeah.
He came out with a CD of flute music recently,
Yeah, I
and
saw signs of that.
it's getting all this backlash in the hip hop community. Like, what are you doing? I think as the actor who was in this recent Netflix film, American Fiction. I'm doing a blank on the name, but he was saying, like, how wonderful is this that Andre 3000 expressing what's inside him. And
Yeah,
I think for all men out there, my message to you would be, like, be yourselves.
yeah. You
And each of you has a masculine and a feminine side within you, and same with women. Also, we all have masculine and feminine within us, and we shouldn't feel threatened to express a fuller version of who we are.
Do you think it's actually, in some ways, what we really need to be thinking of is immaturity? Shouldn't we, as mature, people, especially once you reach 40, shouldn't you be already being what Andre 3000 is? Just being more himself. That should be the ultimate in masculinity. A man who can actually think, this is who I am. I don't need to think of pleasing, my social circle to get their approval. In fact,
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, Sophia, there's some recent research that's showing that this is actually what happens in terms of the way we act. That actually men through the lifespan become more empathetic,
mhm,
and and women
mhm,
throughout the trajectory of their lives become more assertive. And so if you look at men and women in their 50s and 60s, I think what's happening, I've seen this with my own father, is
yeah,
that is that guys, as they become older, they do become more empathetic, and it takes them a while to learn how to express it in a
mhm,
way that they feel is societally sanctioned,
right,
and that they can express this empathy, and they're not going to be considered weak or soft or needy or dependent. And women have to struggle to find a way to express their assertiveness in ways that where they don't start to be, feel that they're being perceived as being bitter or
mhm,
angry or toxic.
yeah,
I think everyone struggles with this, and I think if anything, over the last few decades, there's really been this, like, move toward tolerance and acceptance. I mean, if you look at the speed with which gay marriage has become, like globally uh, favored
yeah,
rather than frowned upon, and just like it just took 2 or 3 decades,
mhm,
which sure is a lot for someone who's who wants to get married and is gay. But if you compare that with, like, okay, how long did it take for us for African Americans to earn the right to vote, or a lot of other disenfranchised communities, for people to change their views? I mean, we're now becoming a more accepting society in many ways,
yeah,
but we have to make room for people to fit into that.
yeah. So it's interesting what you just said about how when a woman gets older, she becomes more assertive, and when a man gets older, he becomes more. Do you think actually it's almost because it's not socially accepted, and so she's been nurturing empathetic her whole life, and then he's had the benefit of that, and it's finally rubbed off, softened him a little, and but because she's had to carry all that empathy and not get the and not get anything back, do you think that
Mm.
then has reversed, where she now feels like, what, I have been carrying this family, and I now want to be a little bit more selfish and think of myself and what I want more, and put my needs first, because she wasn't able to do that in the younger years?
No, I think that's definitely a big part of it, Sophia. Yeah, people over time get tired of subordinating a part of themselves,
Mm,
and they get tired of not showing up as they are. They
yeah,
get tired of wearing a mask.
yeah,
I think that that's the thing. If we go back to social media, it's like now it's just this collective game of self-presentation, of impression management, and people get tired of it. And as you're mentioning, I think people get tired of it also in real life. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that's why we start to express a fuller version of ourselves as we age.
yeah. So dating in the age of distraction. I've noticed again a significant change when I was growing up. There was, in picking partner, in picking your life partner, in picking your friends, you were encouraged to not be superficial, not to focus on money or fame or, uh, but I just feel like now it's greed is good. And, as a woman, you should be thinking about their bank account, things that, were not they want a priority. Now, I can't work out if it's because when I was growing up, maybe we hadn't gone through a recession and everybody kind of was able to earn a decent income, and so you hoped to attract the person that was the kindest, that you were the most attracted to, and then you would both make a go of life, and so we put love first. um, Whereas I hear younger women today saying, well, no, he needs to be able to provide. I won't be able to work. And so I don't know what's shifting in the culture.
I think you're onto something there, Sophia. There's a lot that's shifting. Um, there's, I think part of it is that we have all become optimizers,
Mm-hmm.
where we try to optimize finding that right partner. And so dating, we have this long list of attributes we're looking for in someone, and we think that finding that person with that where we can check off all of those qualities, that's going to be the person that we are going to live happily ever after with. But the problem is, what we've left out of that equation is love, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because love comes unexpectedly, and it doesn't always come for the person who checks off everything on your checklist. I mean, so if you think about it, choosing the right partner is kind of like choosing the right job, or choosing or choosing, I mean, any of these choices, what to eat, where to work, who to go out with. It's always our mind, what our mind thinks and what our heart feels, that come together to make these decisions. And research has shown in many, many different ways that our emotions guide our thinking much more than our thinking guides our emotions. So we what we feel often influences what we think
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately. And so many people, we see this escalating rates of divorce also because a lot of people just don't feel that they're in the right relationship, but often because they're choosing someone again just based on the mind. The problem with the mind is that what the mind thinks is what we think we should do, and this depends on our habit, our like what we've interpreted from our parents and teachers and coaches and friends. Like, this is what I should be doing. So I should, for example, find someone who's wealthy and find someone who's good looking and who everyone else thinks is good looking and makes me look good, and so on and so forth. And so, people are on like Tinder and swiping and just, you know, it's also becoming a losing proposition. I mean, I know guys who swipe like 300 to 500 times just to get someone who swipes back. And I'm talking about swiping right and showing interest. There's actually these studies on the inequality coefficients of online dating. That
Right.
if you look at like the countries in the world with the most inequality, I think it's called the Gini coefficient.
Yeah.
The higher the Gini coefficient, the more inequality there is in the country. Well,
Right.
if you take the curve of different guys, for example, and
Mm-hmm.
you look at like how much are that when they swipe, are they being, are they, swipe right, it's being swiped back, or how many times when they approach someone online, are they receiving a response? That the inequality is worse than any country in the world. It's really, there's like a few guys who are doing extremely well, and who are, good looking with really good jobs, and then there's most guys who are not doing very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, anyway, this is becoming, this kind of worsening the situation,
Mm-hmm.
and this kind of liquid culture where we're in, also where we start to feel like once you do start dating someone, well, okay, I don't like the way, I don't like the way she sleeps with her socks on, or I don't like the way that he, um, you know, I didn't like the way
We
that,
did
that
not
he
look
spoke to this person, and so therefore it's over, right? Because I've got another like hundreds of people in this queue on my dating site, and so we don't really give people as much of a chance.
Yeah, yeah. But do you think that actually what's happening is men who are not doing well? So let's assume that, if it's a dating app, you upload a picture, you're a man, you've got a six pack, so you make sure everybody sees that. You make sure you put in your height, and so you're putting all your physical attributes, right? And of course, you're going to get more swipes. But what has happened with, let's say, shorter guys or who don't match the ideal type for women? It used to be that they had humor to fall back on, and you could go to a party and see a very attractive man, but actually the one who's going to keep you the most engaged is the shorter, funny guy who made you laugh, or the more interested guy who just was seemed to be kind and attentive. Where do you think it's because with dating apps we don't there's no way for them to give that information?
Well, I would say that that is a real problem,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not entirely that. I mean, people find ways to connect. I would say for people to who go on dating apps, and I once went on dating apps, so I'm not looking down on it at all. I would say uh, as soon as possible, you want to get to a telephone call,
Right.
and so you see these courtships that are going on for weeks through chat,
Yeah.
right? And but it's so hard to get to know someone that way, and you actually end up wasting a lot of time. It's like actually talking with someone. There's all kinds of research that shows that the voice is the purveyor of human connection more so than any other element. So, for example, you can compare people who see each other on a video conference where versus those who talk by phone,
Mm-hmm.
and you would think those who video conference are more connected, but that's not what the research shows. They show that actually it's the additive effect of video, of seeing someone. It doesn't add very much. It's essentially voice. But if you look at the difference between electronic communication, like textual exchange,
Mm-hmm.
like a text, a WhatsApp message, email, if you look at that and compare it to a phone call, it's the difference is just huge.
Okay.
People feel much more connected when they talk on the phone. There was a study by Leslie Seltzer at University of Wisconsin where she had these middle school girls work out these math problems in front of strangers, which of course creates a lot of anxiety for them.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did was they're very clever. They thought, okay, let's try to see what happens if the mother calls the daughter right afterwards to say, how are you doing, how are you feeling, versus the mother shows up in person and talks with the daughter. And they compared that with girls who didn't have a mother calling or picking them up, but just watching a movie. Where they found that the levels of cortisol, the stress in
Yeah.
these girls, and that essentially, they looked at cortisol and oxytocin. So the cortisol measures stress, oxytocin measures bonding, connection, and they found that when the girls were watching a movie, there was no change.
Mm.
But when the mother showed up in person or called on the phone, there were similar decreases in cortisol, reduction in stress back to base level, and increase in oxytocin, the sense of bonding and connection. And so then a year later, this was 2011, a year later, 2012, they redid the study, but this time they used an electronic textual exchange. Also, the mothers would send them electronic messages, say, how did it go? How are you?
Yeah.
And what was really unsettling, Sophia, is that again, when it was in person or a phone call, the cortisol went down, oxytocin went up. But when the mothers sent an electronic message, there was no change in cortisol or oxytocin, no reduction in stress, no increase in a sense of bonding and connection. In fact, it was as if they had just watched the movie. It was the same. So that's the thing. I would say keep in mind when you're doing this like text-based courtship and spending all your time on these dating sites, you're not really creating much connection.
Yeah.
You know, as soon as you can. This is the problem for people going on these sites, is that if you try to move from texting or just sending little electronic messages to a phone call too soon, it's like, is he a stalker? Is she needy?
Yes.
Like, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a real delicate balance that people have to find these days.
Text has replaced phone calls for most people. There are only like a handful of people that I still call. But for the majority, it's all text, isn't it? And especially for the younger generation.
Well, that's exactly right. I always say that, you know, electronic communication is that you know that it's I say that it stands for, like, email stands for efficiency mail, but not emotional mail. Because if you look at when we're sending electronic messages, whether it's text or email or whatever, or instant messages, when we're sending these messages, there's a study by Chris Byron at Georgia State University where she found there is a negative affective bias. And what that means is that when you, like an affective or emotional bias, so that means is when you send an email or text intending it for it to be emotionally positive, most of the time the recipient receives it as being emotionally neutral. And when you send that message intending it for it to be emotionally neutral, it's usually received as being emotionally negative. So there's this downward negative emotional slant. There's sort of downstepping of emotion into the realm of negativity whenever we're using electronic communication. So again, I think, okay, look, I also send texts and WhatsApp messages, and there are many times where I don't make a call because I'm like, you know what? I'm just struggling to have enough to have time to really be present father with my children and also get enough work done to uphold a full-time job, right? And so like there are plenty of times I'm like, I don't have time to talk. I'm just going to send a message. But I think the real key is remember that for efficiency purposes, it's great. So send a text to coordinate and let's get together tomorrow at 5. But don't use it to express emotions. You know, I bet every single one of your viewers here, I'll ask each of you right now, how many times have you sent a message electronically for an emotionally delicate issue and you've lost a friendship?
That's so true.
Right? Because it's perceived as being negative, and then people polarize. That's what we're seeing in the world, this polarization, you know?
Wow.
Because of all of this electronic based communications, this downward negative slant that Chris Byron found.
You know what? You say that though. In a way, I think I get it. So, for example, with WhatsApp, it's definitely like even with family relationships, when you text something or someone texts something to you, because it's devoid of tone, you know, if it was an audio, you'd hear the nervousness, you'd hear hesitation, you'd hear all those, which you can't get in a text. But then I'm thinking, in terms of Twitter, would I really want, for example, to read that tweet? Would I want to hear it? Would I want it in video form? Would it make a difference? I don't know. You know.
Well, that's the thing is that
maybe text. Maybe this is the difference.
Okay, you could look at it this way. Okay, if you want to think about communication and what leads to our happiness and reduces our loneliness, it starts with in-person communication, unless it's negative interactions.
Yes.
So positive in-person interactions or neutral in-person interactions lead more to a sense of inclusion, belonging, happiness, well-being. Then you've got electronic communication. But the lowest one are It's going to be the negative in-person interactions. Of course, if you're going to listen to somebody chastising you, belittling you,
Yeah, it's better.
disparaging you, yeah, in person, I mean, that it doesn't get much worse than that, does it?
You're right. You're right. That's it then. For our communications, if I have something harsh to say, it's better to do it in text. If I'm breaking up with someone, it's better to do it in text. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't say that, because I would say that, because a lot of people like right now are ghosting, right? So they do that. They just send that negative message, and then they block the person.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that if you're talking with someone in person,
Mhm.
you're less likely to be as negative, because you see a human being in front of you,
Mhm.
right? And so it's harder to just dismiss them completely. And there's a lot of research that's shown that when we are on electronic based communication, one of the big challenges is the dehumanization. We don't see the other person as a person. We start to see them as like an object.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
so a lot of the times I would say, look, if you have a difficult conversation to have someone and you have something negative to say, I would say first step is to meditate on it, go for a walk, reflect, give yourself some time, and try to let that enemy image evaporate,
Mhm.
because the other person's not your enemy.
Mhm.
Maybe they're a worthy adversary, at the worst,
Mhm.
but they're another human being, and they also, just like you, want to be happy. They wish not to suffer. You can find ways to communicate authentically, assertively, what you feel without putting them down. So, for example, if I say, what the way you acted toward me was just so insensitive and absurd. I don't want you in my life anymore, right?
Mhm.
Instead, I could share, when you didn't show up and we were planning to meet last week, and I'd canceled my dinner with a friend. I felt really sad and frustrated, and I want to share that with you.
Yeah.
Right? So that's different. I'm expressing my feelings. Nobody can argue out of your feelings. No, you weren't sad. No, you weren't frustrated. Yes, I was. You know, I felt rejected,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And like I have a need for respect in my friendships and my relationships with others.
Mhm.
You know, would you be willing to let me know in advance if you need to cancel when
Mhm.
we're planning to get together? So
Mhm.
what I just did, I teach compassionate communication. I'm using that model where you're really focus on your own feelings, and then these basic fundamental human needs that we all have. In this case, it was respect,
Mhm.
but the need could be for security, it could be for belonging, it could be for acceptance. But when we are able to communicate like that with others, it kind of the bridge, sort of the walls between us start to come crumbling down, and we're able to really connect with each other.
Yeah. There's a show called Love is Blind. Have you
Yeah,
seen?
yeah, I'm
Okay.
aware of it. Yeah, I've seen it.
Okay, so in terms of Love is Blind, what you just said kind of applies because they don't really get to see each other or describe each other. And what you find is if two people bonded and then they see each other and they are both attractive, because this is one of the things my friend said to me. She said, "Yeah, easy said. It's not like they're pairing up, but people who are not, conventionally attractive with unattractive. But we've seen in terms of when somebody is with somebody who they meet in person and then they're not what they expected them to be, that never seems to work. It only seems to work when the couples are also attracted to each other physically. So where does that fall into place? One thing to say, oh, he makes me laugh, but then how do we find the right partner and focus on love when
Mhm.
still recognizing that we are human beings and in intimacy, attraction matters?
Well, so I used to have these dreams when I was a kid that I would meet my wife in a dark room where we couldn't see each other. And it
Okay.
was really strange, but that I would really feel seen, even though she couldn't see me.
Hmm.
And that relates back to some trauma I went through growing up. But I really wanted this kind of deep, profound connection,
Hmm.
and that's not how I met my wife,
Hmm.
right? So I've actually met my wife at a sort of restaurant slash. My wife's from Mexico. We met at a restaurant slash bar where she was dancing with like five of her friends, and one of them asked me if I wanted to come and join the group. I said sure, and then I met her, and it was like this guardian angel, this woman who asked me to join the group with them, and um, and you know,
By
I
yourself?
have to say, what's that?
Were you by yourself or with a
I
friend?
was alone. Yes, I
Yeah.
was,
Mhm.
and yeah, because I'm never a lone guy is never going to go talk. Women should, you guys should all know this. A lone guy is not going to come talk with you when you're with five other women, right? Because the rejection by like six women at once is just too much to
Mhm.
risk, right? So I had seen her, and I was wow, she's beautiful, and I wanted to go up and talk with her, but I was, you know, I was fearing that rejection and a bit shy,
Mhm.
and so I was very fortunate. But I have to say, like the physical attraction is a part of it, and I don't think we have to be ashamed about that. I mean, we need to have liftoff.
Right.
You think about it. Think about a boat, right? So the person who makes you laugh and you enjoy conversation and you connect on like your worldview and so forth. That's kind of like the rudder of the boat that steers the boat in the right direction.
Mhm.
But if you don't have fuel, the boat doesn't go anywhere,
Right.
right? So that feeling where your heart, like, it sounds trite, but it kind of skips a beat where you're just like, wow,
Yeah.
like this person, like I really want to get to know them. But the thing is that attraction does not just come from a picture on Tinder or
Mhm.
Grinder or Match.com or Bumble. It comes from when you see people like we as human beings, our social cognition, our capacity to cognitively understand the social world, even what we think is attractive, is conditioned by so many things, and it's conditioned not just by the physical features of a person, but it's also about how they carry themselves. It's about how they smell. It's
Mhm.
about their gait,
Mhm.
the way they tilt their head, the way they lean in or away. There's so many factors. I mean, there's there have been studies that have found you can show people a picture of two presidential candidates for 1/16th of a second. We're talking about 60 milliseconds,
Right.
and within that microsecond, they can tell you with 70% accuracy who's going to win. There's another study where you can show people photos of homosexual and heterosexual men,
Mhm.
and within that 1/16th of a second, they can tell you who's gay and who's straight. So we have this like if you think about it, that's how we as human beings have risen to the top of the food chain. That's how, like, we're able to form clubs and groups and societies and companies, and so forth. And and we so we read each other. So that's the thing. When you're in person, I'm sure you've experienced, Sophia, I certainly have,
Mhm.
where you meet someone online, you go to phone calls, you're talking on the phone for a while, and then you actually meet, and it's just that attraction's not there,
Mhm.
right? Even though you really connected on the phone, and even though you thought with their photo they looked really handsome or beautiful,
Yeah.
and and so I think there's something about this in person. It's just how we're wired as human beings. And so again, like I would say, don't waste your time spending, like, it's great when you're lonely to have someone who's a stranger to chat with for 6 hours until 2 in the morning. But
Yeah.
if you've never met them,
Yeah.
at least get to a phone call as soon as you can, and then get from a phone call to an in-person meeting. It's just, there's really no substitute.
Yeah. But then that brings us again to dating over 40. So,
Mhm.
I mean, again, just thinking like I haven't fully watched it. I want to. Is The Golden Bachelor. Do
Mm.
you think people can date over 40 and find love like they would have in their younger years? Because because one thing I've noticed is, again, aging is something that I am trying to spend more time to understand.
Mhm.
I have elderly neighbors in their 80s, 90s, and 105 is the oldest neighbor that I have who's a friend. And so, what I'm noticing is people who are elderly don't actually recognize the face that is looking at them in the mirror, which has surprised me because
Mm.
I've noticed, just whenever we're taking pictures, And I see that with myself. I see it with almost everyone who's now, let's say, 60, 70 above. Is, do you think whenever, once we start to really see those, the changes of that time does to us, do you think there's going to be a forever cognitive dissonance? Where we will just not know who we are. And then what effect does that have on us pairing up with somebody who, and believing that they're attracted to us when we're not attracted to ourselves?
Well, I'll tell you, Sophia, like my interpretation of what you shared is like how important it is that we are attracted to ourselves, that we love ourselves, that we're comfortable with ourselves, because that's the beginning of all other forms of love.
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't love ourselves, it's impossible to love another person. At the same time, sometimes loving others is how we learn to love ourselves. Like I will tell you, I grew up not loving myself. I grew up with like physical abuse from a stepfather and feeling like, hey, if this guy comes into my home who's not my father and beats me up and sleeps with my mother, then I must not be much of a person. And so I had a lot of challenges like that, and even just fitting in because I felt like ostracized in many ways because other kids picked up on my lack of self-esteem. And one of the things I learned was, I went to Kenya, as you know, and at first I went there as a Peace Corps volunteer, which is kind of like your British, volunteer services overseas, BSO. Anyway, I went as a volunteer for 2 years, and then I started an NGO and went back for the next 10 years, repeatedly every year. And what I learned was by learning to love others, I really sort of realized this is the beauty of people by experiencing rural Kenya and how people would like come together and people were so empathetic. Like I'd be walking down the street and someone would say, "Hey, you're not feeling well? You look a little different than you did yesterday," and things that hadn't experienced that with people attuning to me so much.
Mm-hmm.
And in a really tight community like that, growing up in Washington D.C. was not like that for me. And so as I learned to love others, I also learned to love myself because I realized like, well, I guess I have something worthy within myself to give, and that's why I've been accepted here in this community.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed everything. And I think this is the problem. A lot of us, certainly over 40, and also younger too, we go, well, why am I single on Valentine's Day? Like why haven't I found, if I'm so wonderful, why haven't I found the right person? And so again, it's this kind of like victimization, like why am I not loved?
Mm-hmm.
What we don't realize is that we are loved. If you actually we hold our hands over our eyes and we cry about how dark it is.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of opening our taking our hands off our eyes, opening our eyes and going, wow, there is love all around me.
Mm-hmm.
And through family, through friends, through colleagues, and I'm just not acknowledging it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not recognizing it. I'm insisting that love show up on my doorstep in the form I want it in, and I'm not recognizing the love that is here around me every single day. And once we can make that leap and recognize the love that surrounds us, then we have something to give, and then we go toward relationships in a different way, and we won't accept anything other than love. So I often tell people, you in your intimate part of your life, you only speak to one person, but you speak through a lot of other people to that person. So for example, if you're on a date sitting across the table from someone,
Mm-hmm.
don't speak to that person, speak through that person to your life partner, and ask that life partner, is this you?
Mm-hmm.
Is this not you? What should I be doing here?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very interesting way of communicating, because we're almost always just talking to an image or a label that we attach to someone. So, for example, just in what you've disclosed to me, in my head, like if I saw you, I would think, okay, he looks like Bruce Springsteen. He's probably had he was probably the high school good-looking guy, and that's what your things are that you've had to overcome. That would have been my assumption. I wouldn't think, that you've had a tough time with a stepfather, and you had all these issues that come from that trauma. So it's just interesting because if we met on a dating app, that's what you would think is, okay, he's American. And we just come up with all these labels that are generated from stuff we've watched, stuff we've been told, stuff we've read.
Well, and that's why, Sophia, that when I think about the trauma I went through, the physical abuse, when I think about, running away from home and feeling like I didn't have a safe place I could go, and I realized that I'm grateful for all of that.
Mm.
And this will sound strange, but I wouldn't be here talking with you like this if I hadn't gone through what I went through.
Mm.
I would be another person.
Okay,
In fact, I can almost tell you with some confidence, I probably would have had 3 divorces and be driving a red sports car, and I wouldn't know my children.
Mm.
And I don't want to ever be that guy.
Mm.
So I'm grateful for what I experienced, because the abusive stepfather was, I write about this in Love and Suffering, is that he was my greatest teacher. He taught me about what I didn't want in my life, and he also taught me to appreciate the people who are loving toward me. And
Mm.
he also taught me that, like, you have to find your bliss, your love within yourself, because he didn't have that. And you
Mm.
think about it, what kind of person is going to go and physically assault a young boy,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So it's clearly someone who is not doing very well in their own life, and also maybe someone who grew up with that, like, that this is okay, this is what men do to boys, and so forth.
Someone else's
And
child. But probably he would do that to his own son, right?
yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't ask for it,
Mm.
but I'm grateful that it happened, because it taught me a lot about suffering, and it helped me to connect with others who suffer.
Mm.
And I think that's given me a sense of purpose in my life, and I don't think I would have had it otherwise.
Mm. You're actually right, because that's the thing. In our culture, we don't want any suffering. We don't want it for our children. We go to therapy to erase suffering. And so you think about it, do you think we'd all be just shallow people if we went through no challenges, no suffering, and we wouldn't actually have the empathy that enriches us?
Well, it's like when it's sunny all the time. If you want to live in a place that's sunny all the time, you end up in a desert, right? I mean, so we need the rain. We need the rain. We talked about Boys to Men earlier, right? So remember New Edition, Can You Stand the Rain?
Yeah, that's true.
When we recognize that our suffering is just an emotion,
Hmm.
our suffering is an emotion, and to not experience an emotion like suffering, we're also not going to experience an emotion like happiness, because we have to be able to experience all of our emotions, and not run from them, but understand them.
Yeah,
It's like, I don't know if you ever saw The Exorcist, the film,
yeah.
but
Well,
in ancient mythology,
mhm.
the first thing an exorcist would do with someone who is possessed by a demon is to get them to name the demon. And by naming our suffering, by naming what we've experienced, it no longer has control over us. We're able to see it and say, okay, and understand it and use it. A lot of people don't know this, but the word passion, the etymology of passion in Latin is pati, or patire, which means to suffer. So suffering is actually the root of passion. You think about it, in Christianity, you have the crucifixion, the suffering, the passion of Christ. In many, for example, in African American culture, you have the rising of the phoenix from the ashes. In many ethnic and cultural religious traditions, you have this idea of something beautiful coming out of suffering. And I think, if we go from there to the, like emotion, the emotion theorists, like the Dutch psychologist Nico Friesda, or Richard Lazarus at Berkeley, finding that whenever we experience a negative emotion, it's because there's something we love, there's something we care about,
Mhm.
and our goals or values in relation to it are being thwarted, are
Mhm.
being obstructed. So when suffering tells us what we love and who we love,
Yeah.
because when we suffer, we say, okay, then if you're suffering in relation to a person, or a thing, or an idea or a mission. Like if you suffer when you read those tweets that are putting down women, Sophia, it tells you really care about gender equality,
Mhm.
right? And you have this love for humanity that goes beyond our gender, and that's the thing, is that suffering opens up this whole new world to us, to recognize what we love, and then do something to move that in a positive direction.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't trade it.
Me, I think for me, I've grown up with a lot of males that I love, in my own family. And so I just, when I see a man talking that way, or even a woman who's so fixated on all the hurts and all the things that men do, it makes me think that she must not have experienced any of the mitigating stuff. Like she hasn't experienced a protective male, or he hasn't experienced a sister who nurtures him. And then what I worry about is how many others are growing up without that, and that what impact is that having on our culture? Let's say, like if you grew up in that type of home environment, and then you didn't have a female who nurtures you, and that's really more of my
Mm.
concern. Whereas I'm 40 something, I've experienced a lot of love in my life, that there's just no way that somebody could make me take on a collective image of men and then think this is what all men are, this is what all women are, this is what all whites are or blacks are, because that's not my experience.
Yeah, at the bottom, the bottom line, the end of the day, we're the end of the road. We're all human beings, right?
Hmm.
And and I think what we you heard the term helicopter parents,
Yeah.
but I don't know if you've also heard this term, like bulldozer parents, where we're trying to bulldoze everything in front of our kids so they don't experience any adversity, any suffering. The whole trigger warning movement, and like we don't want anyone to be triggered or to experience any difficult emotions, or challenging emotions, but that's how we learn.
Mm.
We learn by our through our challenges, and going out there and experiencing, hey, so this didn't work out well for me,
Hmm.
but learning from it. I mean, I can tell you, how fortunate are we? I mean, how it's part of what I write about in Love and Suffering, is like, even if you have a relationship that doesn't work out, we should all feel grateful to have that opportunity. How many people don't have the opportunity to have a relationship?
Yes.
It's like, you're finding another person to jump in the ring with and try to work out some of your demons, work out, some of your emotions, understand yourself, and understand what you're looking for in a partner. And that's again what I mean about that we talk through everyone else to one person.
Hmm.
And so each of those experiences brings us closer to that person. And they're difficult to find, but they're out there.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a matter, persistence doesn't mean insistence, right? So it doesn't, being persistent doesn't mean insisting on one way of doing things. It means learning and changing and growing, and seeing, okay, so maybe I need to approach this differently, and figure out what works.
Yeah. Recognize the patterns that didn't work and then think, okay, and research and see, okay, what can I be doing differently? I really love that. Persistence is not insistence. Because if you're just repeating the same mistakes, you're going to end up in the same place.
Yeah, that's saying if you keep doing what you've been doing, you'll keep getting what you've been getting, right? So yeah, we need to not just go through life, but grow through life, and be grateful for these opportunities to go out there and test what we have, and build our resources, our social, emotional, psychological, cognitive resources, to just show up better over time, and hope that if we're really, really lucky, that right person will show up one day.
And your book has tips for us, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So really looking, really to look at what one of the main sort of ideas in Love and Suffering is that there's this model where we have these, we have to overcome certain obstacles to move on our path toward love. And so we start with suffering. We have to go past that to acceptance. Acceptance is like what I call the first plateau. So accepting that there is suffering and that we can learn from it. And then the next obstacle is resentment. And so I go into resentment, and the psychological research on resentment, and to overcome resentment, we need to overcome it to get to our next plateau, which is forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, we keep going finally to get to gratitude and get to love.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of counterintuitive kind of ideas and strategies in love and suffering. So for example, this whole idea that forgiveness is one of the highest forms of love, that's pretty entrenched in our society.
Yeah.
I'd say that that's completely wrong,
Mm-hmm.
because to forgive someone, you first have to judge them. That's the obstacle we have to get over to get to gratitude, right? So after forgiveness, so you can't forgive someone unless you first judge them. But what if you didn't judge them in the first place? What if we recognize that, okay, they're a human being like myself.
Yeah.
They're doing the best they can with the resources they have,
Mm-hmm.
the cognitive, emotional, spiritual, social resources that they have,
Mm-hmm.
and recognize that, like, at this point in time, I have different values than they do, or than they did, and so without the judgment, there's no need for the forgiveness. And I don't mean that forgiveness is a bad thing to do. It's not. Often it's necessary to move on that path toward gratitude, but there's something higher than forgiveness, which is gratitude, which is, instead of saying I forgive you, you think about it, I forgive you is like a paternalistic. It's a paternalistic act. It's like I hold propriety over what's right and wrong. You've done wrong, and I forgive you for it. I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be forgiven by people with that kind of language, right? Because it's so laced with judgment, and that's what we do. Most of us, though, do the same thing, but it's implicit. It's subconscious. And if we instead move past forgiveness and we say, okay, I really didn't like what this person did, but how did I grow from it? Grow from it. How are they a teacher for me?
Yeah.
Then we start to experience gratitude, and we say, for example, maybe you had this past partner for a few years, and you say, I really resent, like, why didn't it work out? And then in the end, they weren't as committed as I was, and why didn't it work out? And instead of going from resentment and through forgiveness to finally saying, okay, you know what? I'm grateful, because I realize now that that person who's, like, really good looking and cool and has this great social status, that's not really most important to me anymore. What's important to me is someone who matches my commitment,
Mm-hmm.
is somebody who really cares about me. And so you look for something different now,
Mm-hmm.
and that you never would find if it weren't for what you learned from that person. And so we go from forgiveness to gratitude, and then that opens the door, ultimately, toward love. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of strategies around that, and
I love that
yeah.
take, because that's exactly what's missing. Is we're just told, this person hurt you, forgive them, and it's almost just as if if there's no process that you're going to go through with anything, it doesn't, you can't really, you're just putting a band-aid on it and saying, oh, I forgive them, but really you haven't. And
Well,
yeah.
the whole idea that this person harmed me, this person wronged me.
Yeah.
But what if they actually righted you? What if there was a part of you that was really underdeveloped, and that relationship helped you develop it? Then I would say, so. So, for example, when I do a lot of research on trauma, and how people, like, trauma informed leadership, and I do a lot of interviews with people experiencing tremendous trauma, and I start by asking them, so, like, what has this trauma led to in your life? And so it's this gloom and doom first half hour of the interview, the stress, the unprovoked incidences of fear in the middle of the night, and all the other sort of tragic moments the trauma brought into their life. And then somewhere around halfway through the interview, I'll say, um, think about the person you are now and the person you used to be before you went through this trauma.
Mm-hmm.
How have you changed? How are your values different? How has the trauma benefited you? And it's just, the whole interview changes, and all of a sudden it's like I never would be doing what I'm doing now if it weren't for what I experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, I've really changed completely, like, what I'm looking for in a partner, or what I want to do in my career, or, so you get all these kinds of, think about how many people do you know, Sophia, who after COVID completely changed their lives towards something different, whether it's career, or their intimate life, or how they pursue friendships. And
Mm-hmm.
so these kind of traumatic experiences, we don't ask for them,
Mm-hmm.
but they happen whether we ask for them or not. And it's our choice. It's our, we're, have you ever heard that we're response able instead of responsible? We're response able. We're able to choose our response.
Yeah.
This is what differentiates us from most other animals
The
in terms of how we want to perceive what we've experienced in our lives and how we want to go forward with it.
Yeah. How would you say, using that as an example, you talk through to somebody who maybe put up with an abusive marriage for 20, 30 years, the kids are older, she doesn't know herself anymore, and she's just stuck in that bitter place? Would you say to focus on the fact that she has the kids now, and and there's so much else that she can focus on that has also been enriching?
Well, as I write about it in Love and Suffering, like resentment, if we look at the word resentment, it comes from which is again, and sentire, which is to feel. So to resentment is to feel anger again and again and again and again until we become completely paralyzed and stuck. And so forgiveness is, a lot of people don't realize this, forgiveness is much more for ourselves than for the other person. It's so that we can move past that resentment
Mm-hmm.
and start clearing the way so we can move toward gratitude. And and if she can enter that space and say, okay, well, what does she have to be grateful for? She has these wonderful children. A lot of people don't have children, but
Mm-hmm.
she's got children.
Mm-hmm.
And she has a relationship with her children. I'm sure she has some relationships with friends and others.
Mm-hmm.
And and sort of come back to, instead of feeling the victim of all this because a relationship didn't work out,
Mm-hmm.
and because I feel unloved in the intimate part of my life, where is the love surrounding me right now?
Mm,
With her children, with her friends, and use that to build and reconstruct a sense of self. And
mhm.
then from that place of strength, then she can start moving out into the world again, but not until she first reaches that place.
Yeah. I've just had one last one.
Sure,
Sorry.
sure.
Okay, so
Hmm.
a lot of women tell me that the biggest regret they have is not having children, and or not having the family they wanted, if they wanted, more children.
Hmm.
This is something I've managed to reconcile within myself. I always thought, I come from a huge family. I always thought I want a huge family with
Hmm.
at least, several children. But then once I became a parent, I realized actually, I might not have been able to cope with the huge family that I wanted. What would you say to people who struggle with that still and think, okay, I don't have children, but I wish I could be a mom?
Well, I would say to again to move from resentment, which is like feeling angry or feeling sad, over and over again because they don't have children, is to say, well, what do they have, right? And to be grateful for this feeling inside of them that they have this love to give to a child or to children. That's beautiful. A lot
Mhm.
of people don't have that.
Mm.
And now what can they do with that? How can they take this love inside them
Mhm.
and find a way to target it in the universe?
Yeah,
Because there's a lot of children out there that don't have families.
that's true.
There are a lot of children that don't have families, and there are a lot of children that have toxic families.
Mm.
And there are so many ways. Remember, we said like toxic negative interactions or even below text-based interactions, right?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of children, as we've talked about throughout this session, that are experiencing tremendous loneliness, anxiety, depression,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of ways that we can give. And love is really about giving. It's about, and not only that, but power is about giving. And so when like one of these people who feels like, oh, I wish I had children, I never had children, could feel powerless, right? But I would say that we have zero power in our lives to receive what we want, whether it's children or a raise or a new car. But we have 100% power over two things: how, what, when, and how we give to others,
Mm.
and the power to change ourselves. That's what we have power over: giving to others and changing ourselves. And so there's so many ways that someone can go out and give to children. In fact, if you look at the research on loneliness, there's essentially what's the closest there is to a panacea for loneliness is volunteering in your community, finding a way to give back, This is because you go out, you meet other people. In this case, if you want to volunteer in your community in a way that's helping children, you're also going to be able to be helpful for children and share your love with children. And so I think there's so many things that we can do, and
So that
I
is
think
really about recognizing that you have this gift, which I haven't heard it, said in that way, because a lot of times we think, okay, I wish I had children, but we're not recognizing that you could have had the children and then be missing that love. There's so many children you read about who are abused by their own parents.
exactly.
If you recognize that maternal love and then think, how can I then, it's obviously an impulse that wants to come out into the world. How do we then present it and do something with that love, right?
Exactly. I mean, the reality is that actually Pascal, the philosopher, said it really well. All of us have something. None of us have everything. So, and I remind myself of that when I think like, well, again, it's that social comparison. Like, so, I think about like, okay, it's so easy to compare yourselves to people that are doing better than you in your field. And I do that sometimes. And and then I remind myself, well, there's a lot of people struggling too. And the important thing is, how am I giving? How am I helping? It's not about like, am I on the New York Times bestseller list, or do I have millions of readers? It's about, how am I helping each reader?
Yes.
How am I helping each person?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. Like none of us can have everything, and we have to say, okay, well, what do we have? How can we give? What can we do with it? How can we contribute?
Yeah. I completely agree with you. Actually, I have the opposite, where I look at so many of the very, very powerful people, again, like so many of the big social media people who just literally will say anything to get followers and
Mm,
to get engagement. And once you see that and you think, but I've touched two people. I'd rather touch two people in a very sincere way that's come from our hearts than a million. You have millions of people who you're ruining their day. You're driving them crazy. You're putting ideas in their head that's not going to benefit their lives. And
yeah.
there's so much of that now that I think the metric for success anymore is.
No, I totally agree with you, Sophia. In fact, there's been some studies that have shown that, like, if you take politicians and when they express positive versus negative messages on Twitter or Facebook, that the messages that are negative tend to get like 2 to 3 times the retweets and likes than the ones that are positive.
Wow.
And so that's the thing, is that negative events draw our attention. And they say in the news, they've said this for centuries, like, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
And so there's, well, I know, centuries, at least many decades. And so, what we're doing here today, I think we've had a really positive conversation. And I think, I'm hoping some people are watching this and they say, hey, I do want to make a positive change in my life, from this conversation between Sophia and Tony. And that's what we're here for. That's where the contribution we're trying to make. And I think, I don't know, I think for me, I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for the discussion we've had, because this is an opportunity to live my purpose. So thank you, Sophia, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Tony. We will link everything and I'll tag your social follows. Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds great, Sophia. Thank you.